Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. As we're waiting for audience members to stream in, I'll do a quick round of introductions and just talk about how you can ask questions during the webinar. My name is Kaushik Krishnan. I work at CMIE. My job is to make the record level data from the Consumer Pyramids Household Survey available and accessible to researchers across the globe. I have with me Mahesh Vyas. Mahesh is the CEO and MD of CMIE. Mahesh is also the chief architect of the Consumer Pyramids Household Survey. Hi, Mahesh. Thanks for coming. All right, so we have another 2 minutes while audience members come in. I don't think this needs to be said anymore since almost all of us live in Zoom webinars. But if you have questions, feel free to type them in the Q&A box. I will be giving the presentation for the first 1 hour. But during that time, as you have questions, please feel free to type them in. Mahesh will try and respond in real time. Some questions might require a bit more of an interactive answer or an answer after the presentation is done. So we've scheduled another 30 minutes after the presentation is done to answer questions. There's usually a fair amount of volume in terms of questions, so we might not be able to answer all of them, but we'll certainly get to as many questions as we can during the Q&A as possible. Needless to say, if you've asked us a question, regardless of whether you have it answered in the Q&A box, whether you have it answered in the interactive session, or not at all because we ran out of time, we'll make sure that we get back to each of you individually so that we can answer your questions. It's almost 10:05 India time and 5 minutes past the start time wherever all of you are. So I'm going to start the presentation now. Mahesh, can you quickly confirm that you can see my screen? You'll need to go off mute.
Yes, we can see.
Okay, great. All right, everyone. Thank you for coming. This talk, if you've stumbled into the wrong Zoom room, is an introduction to the Consumer Pyramids Household Survey. It's CPHS for short. So we'll dive right into it because we have a lot of material to cover, a lot of things to say to be able to answer a very simple question, which is what is CPHS? So the simplest answer is that CPHS is India's largest regular household survey. An even more ambitious answer is that CPHS is today the world's largest household panel survey, where the same households are interviewed across time. We can answer this question in a couple of other ways. One is to talk about how long this survey has already gone on for. The survey has now completed 21 waves of surveying already. In terms of sample size, the current sample size is 174,405 households that we survey every wave across the country. That number is growing. In fact, in the very next wave, that number is going to be even higher than what it currently is. As a proportion of India, the survey covers a landmass that accounts for 98.5% of India's population. So very, very little of India's landmass is missed out by this survey. In terms of the breadth of the survey itself, we're kind of most known, I would say, for some of our labor force indicators, but we capture over 600 indicators on these households and on the individuals in these households. And finally, in terms of research output, we're very proud to say that in an incredibly short span of time, there are already over 30 papers that have been written. The majority of them have just been written in the last year. And I'm going to use these 5 facts to help talk in a little more detail about what this survey does and what data is available for researchers. So first, let me talk about these 21 waves. The survey began in 2014, specifically on the 1st of January in 2014. And we do 3 waves of the survey every year, which means that the second wave of every year begins on the 1st of May, and the third wave of every year begins on the 1st of September. So there are 3 waves a year. We started in 2014. And if you do the math, There's been 3 waves in 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, and 2020, which is 7 years of completed surveying, which means 21 waves of surveys have already been completed by CPHS. Right now, we're in the first wave of 2021, which is the 22nd wave of data collection. Now, this is, I think, a really important and amazing point about CPHS. We have not missed a single year in the field since 2014. In fact, we've not missed a single wave in the field since 2014. In fact, we've not even missed a single month or a single week or even a single day in the field since 2014. Every single day across the country, on average, somewhere between 1,000 and 1,200 households are getting surveyed by Consumer Pyramids Household Survey. You'll see there's an asterisk for my claim about not having missed even a single day in the field. We have been in the field for every single day of the calendar year, for every year from 2014 until today, including holidays, including weekends, including storms, including floods, you name it. CPHS has been on the ground. There's been one exception. CPHS was not on the ground on the 24th of March of last year. That was the first of the many curfews that were, of the nationwide curfews that were imposed as a response to the COVID-19 pandemic. We missed exactly 1 day in the field because of this. We were immediately back into the field after that. We have an entire 1.5 hour long webinar about how we conducted the survey during the lockdown. If any of you have questions about that, we'll be happy to answer them in the Q&A, and we'll also be very happy to refer you to the documentation that we have written, as well as the YouTube lecture about how we conducted the survey during the lockdown. Okay, now that you have some sense of the time span that this survey has been in operation, let me tell you a little bit about the sample size. So like I said, we have 174,405 households that are a part of our sample. And while that number is big and impressive, it would be much less impressive if all 174,405 of those households were selected from the same town, right? So if all of them were selected from Mumbai, that would not be a very useful survey to understand India. We do things a little better than that. I would say much better than that. As many of you know, India is divided into states. Administratively, those states are divided again into districts. As of the 2011 census, there were 640 districts across India. We aggregate those districts up into something called homogeneous regions. We aggregate those 640 districts into 110 homogeneous regions. Homogeneous regions, for us, are slightly different than districts. They're an agglomeration of districts that share, they have to be neighbors, so they have to share borders, and they have to share similar agroclimatic conditions. That's the most important consideration. And they should also share similar urbanization levels, similar rates of female literacy, and similar rates of household size. And we put these districts together slightly differently from divisions. For those of you that are familiar with divisions in India, districts are also administratively aggregated up into something called divisions, which are aggregated up into states. Divisions are more administrative boundaries. Homogeneous regions are more sensible collections of districts that can be compared together. To give you an example, this is Punjab. Punjab has very clearly marked out agroclimatic zones. Punjab actually has 5 agroclimatic zones. In our context, in the CMIE context, we turn those into 3 belts. The first is the undulating zone, which is on top. The second is the central plains. And then the third is the western zone, which is on the bottom left. This process is done for every state, where districts are collected together into what we call homogeneous regions. Once you have one of those homogeneous regions, and here's another state just as an example, this is the state of Karnataka. Karnataka is broken up into 5 homogeneous regions. I'm taking one just as an example. For every homogeneous region, we divide that homogeneous region into a rural stratum, which consists of all the villages in that homogeneous region. We have that list from the 2011 census. So we have the full universe of all of the villages for a homogeneous region. We have the same thing for all the towns in a homogeneous region. From census 2011, we have a list of all those towns. But rather than break every HR into just a rural stratum and an urban stratum, we actually break down the urban stratum by town size. And so we have one urban stratum, which is just for very large towns. Those are towns that have over 200,000 households, approximately over 1 million people. The next town size stratum are large towns. Those are towns that have between 60,000 and 200,000 households. The third town size stratum are medium towns. Those are towns that have between 20 and 60,000 households. And the fourth are finally small towns that have less than 20,000 households. There are many reasons why we do this. One of them is in 2011, there was a proliferation of small towns in the census. And so if we didn't stratify on town size and we randomly picked towns, the likelihood that we would pick large towns would diminish because of the very large number of small towns. Another reason is there's a lot of interest in urban India among researchers and specifically in studying different sizes of towns. And to cater to that, we create strata for small towns, medium towns, large towns, and very large towns separately so that there's enough sample in each of these strata. Okay, now that you know how a homogeneous region is broken down, which is into a rural component and an urban component, with the urban component then being broken down into small towns, large towns, small towns, medium towns, large towns, and very large towns, how do we actually select the villages and towns that are a part of our survey? Well, within every homogeneous region, we simply select 30 villages at random through simple random selection. So we know the universe of all villages in every HR. We just select 30 of them at random. That's our rural sample for a given HR. For the urban sample, like I said, since we stratify on town size, we ensure that at least one very large, one medium, and one small town gets selected for each HR that we survey. That's as long as this is possible. Some homogeneous regions might not have a very large town, or they might not have a large town. In that case, of course, we don't select a large town or a very large town, but conditional on a homogeneous region having a very large town, a medium town, and a small town at least, we make sure that we select at least one from each of those town size classes. Now, once we select a town, we actually do even more randomization. We know that towns are broken down into wards, and wards are finally broken down into something called census enumeration blocks. So for every selected town, we select 21 census blocks at random. This ensures that we're not clustering our surveying in particular portions or particular geographies of towns that might be more or less affluent, etc. And so we randomly select, through simple random sampling, a minimum of 21 CEBs from every town that's in our sample. Now, this is a minimum. As we get to medium towns, large towns, and very large towns, we select more CEBs. 21 CEBs is a floor for the number of CEBs that every town contributes as far as the survey is concerned. So just to recap, we have the universe of all villages. We select 30 villages at random. We have the universe of all towns. We select at random very large towns, medium towns, and small towns separately. For every town that's selected, we select a minimum of 21 census blocks, again at random. All right, that's how we select what we call our primary sampling units. Primary sampling units are villages, towns, and census blocks. Once we have those, for every village and for every census block in urban India, we select 16 households, again at random. The difference here is that we don't select them by simple random sampling, we select them by systematic random sampling. There's a host of reasons for why we do this, and we have a very clear protocol for how we do the systematic random sampling for a given village or for a given census block. I'm not covering that in this talk because we have to cover a lot of material. That being said, just a couple of weeks ago, we did another 1.5 hour long lecture just on how we do the sampling. That goes into the details, really into the weeds of how we do the systematic random sampling. I'm sure there are questions coming up in the Q&A, which Mahesh will try to answer as well. There's also a lot of documentation that you can read, which is all on our website. It's freely and publicly available. But please feel free to ask questions and we'll do our best to answer them during this talk. Okay, so now that you know how we select villages, towns, and blocks, and then within those villages and census blocks, how we finally select individual households, this is a heat map of the rural and urban distribution of our sample. So we have in total 64,000 rural households and 110,000 urban households. Like I said, this is by design. Roughly 2 times as many urban households as rural households. This is by design so that we have a thick enough sample that researchers can study urban India on its own and can also study just the very large towns on their own, or just the large towns, or just the small towns, or just the medium towns on their own. Okay, so that in a nutshell is how we reach the sample size of 174,405 households. The next thing that I want to tell you all about is this claim, which is that the survey covers a landmass of India that contributes 98.5% of India's total population. Okay, it's a little hard for us to show this to you graphically on a map, but we'll show this to you graphically in a somewhat more abstract way. Um, for those of you that have followed along so far, India is divided into 640 districts. We agglomerate those districts up into 110 homogeneous regions. Each homogeneous region is broken down theoretically into a rural stratum, into a very large town urban stratum, into a large town urban stratum, into a medium town urban stratum, and to a small town urban stratum. So in theory, every of those 110 HRs can have 5 strata, right? That's what we're trying to graphically depict here. You have 110 HRs. Each of them, in principle, has a rural stratum, a small town stratum, a medium town stratum, a large town stratum, and a very large town stratum. Now, of those 550 theoretical strata that exist, 138 of them don't exist. What do I mean by that? I mean that it's the case that 10 out of the 110 homogeneous regions that we have simply don't have a rural component. Similarly, one of the 110 homogeneous regions that we have don't have a small town component. The same is true for medium towns, large towns, and very large towns. So 138 of the 550 strata that theoretically exist are immediately taken out simply because they don't exist in reality. Of the remaining 412, there are some parts of India that aren't accessible to us. These are the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, Arunachal Pradesh, Dadra and Nagar Haveli, Daman and Diu, Ladakh, Manipur, Mizoram, Nagaland, and Sikkim. They're inaccessible for different reasons depending on the geography. In some cases, these are border areas and we require more infrastructure and logistical support than we currently have to be able to serve them. In other cases, like in Ladakh, Ladakh is not accessible throughout the year, but the survey is a survey that never stops. And so we have to go to that region 3 times a year, etc. But of the 412 strata that actually exist, 23 of them are inaccessible to CPHS and we don't survey those regions. Now, an additional 10, some of them are rural strata, some of them are small town strata, some of them are medium town strata. An additional 10 strata in total aren't yet being surveyed by us. They're accessible, but CPHS doesn't survey them. But as you can see, Wave 23, which is coming up, which starts on the 1st of May of this year, as early as Wave 23, we're going to start surveying those regions bit by bit. And so we currently survey 379 of the 412 real strata that exist across India. But those 379 already account for 92% of all possible strata and 98.5% of India's population, according to the 2011 census. So we already have an incredibly wide reach across the country, and we're still improving on that wave over wave. Okay, so that's a little bit about the claim that CPHS covers 98.5% of India's population. Now I'm going to turn to something that's going to take up potentially the meat of this talk, which is taking all of you through the data that we actually collect on these households and in these individuals. Now, it's impossible for me to go through all 600 indicators, and to go through all 600 of them would be a very boring talk. So instead, what we're doing is we're trying to collect some of the indicators that we think are useful to researchers. And of course, like I said, all of our documentation, including a list of indicators, how the questions are actually asked, what validations we do during the survey, all of this is available on our website. It's freely available. And so you should feel free to go to our website, click on how we do it, and you will find all of this documentation available in PDF format or as HTML files. Okay, so CPHS is thematically broken up into 4 different pillars. The first of those pillars is called People of India. This is just information about the individuals that live in the households that are a part of our sample. So starting with identity information, we capture everything from caste to gender to marital status to religion to the relationship to the head of the household to age. And note that we capture something called caste separately from caste category. Those of you that are familiar with the study of India, especially on questions of caste, We capture jati level information, which is caste, separately from caste category, which is whether you qualify for a certain legally protected status. We also have some information on where you're from. We ask state of origin, but we also have now a very detailed migration module. That means for every member that enters the household other than through childbirth and exits the household other than through death, we know the reason that they entered the household or they left the household. We also know where they came from and where they're going to. And for every member of the household, we also ask, do you have an intention to leave the household in the future? If so, where do you plan to go? When do you plan to go? And why do you plan to leave the household? So this is very, very rich and detailed coverage on migration that we have now. On top of that, we cover a lot of information on education. We ask whether members are literate. We capture their educational qualifications, and above a certain threshold in terms of educational qualifications, we also capture information on the discipline of their study. Then we capture a bunch of information on financial inclusion. This includes information on whether the member has a life insurance account, a bank account, a Kisan credit card, a regular credit card, an EPF account, a health insurance account, a mobile phone, and a DMAT account. Some of these terms might sound a bit alien to folks that don't necessarily study India. They're kind of peculiar indicators of financial inclusion. And again, we're happy to talk to you more about what those indicators mean and how they might be relevant to your research. Like I said, if anything, we're known for our employment statistics, but really we're known for one of 10 or 11 employment statistics, which is just employment status. But much more than employment status, we collect a lot more data. For example, we know how long a particular individual has enjoyed the employment status that they have. In India, in particular, many people are interested in questions about formal and informal labor market arrangements. That's captured in employment arrangement, where we know whether you're salaried full-time, salaried part-time, whether you're a daily wage worker, whether you're self-employed, etc. We also have a full-time and part-time indicator separately from this. We know place of work, which is very interesting. So physically, do you work in a factory? Do you work in a laboratory? Do you work in a university, etc.? What is your occupation? We capture this in a variety of different ways. We also capture the industry in which you work. This data is rich enough, in my opinion, that, for example, just a couple of weeks ago, a subscriber wanted to know if you could identify, for example, barbers that own their own hair salon separately from barbers that worked for somebody else. And you can, through a triangulation of different labor force variables. And that becomes very interesting when you're trying to study, for example, the impacts of something like COVID-19 and the lockdown on people that are self-employed in a certain kind of occupation versus people that perform the same work but are paid a wage by someone else. Okay, let's move on. We do have some information on health. I think very, very critically, 3 incredibly important questions. 1, is this member on regular medication? 2, is this member healthy? And 3, finally, is this member hospitalized? On top of that, we have a time use survey built into the household survey. For every member of the household above the age of 12, we ask questions on the amount of time that they've spent on all of these activities. They range from indoor entertainment, hanging out, learning, outdoor sports, religious activities, travel, work. Work is again broken down into paid work, unpaid work, work at home, etc. So incredibly useful time use data that's only now starting to get used by academics. Okay, now all of this is just the first of the 4 pillars that I described. This is just about the individuals that live in these households. Analogously, we also want to capture information at the household level. So at the household level, we have a second module called Aspirational India, which just captures information on households. This includes information on asset ownership. For example, everything from whether you own a car to a television set to a generator to cattle. And we ask this question at 3 levels. Do you own any of these assets? Do you intend to purchase any of these assets in the coming 120 days? Have you purchased any of these assets in the previous 120 days? And I think that level of richness, again, makes it very useful to study. On the savings side, we do something similar. So we ask whether the household has a saving in any of these savings and investment instruments. Again, they range across the board from gold, which is incredibly common, to fixed deposits and bank accounts, to listed shares in real estate, right? So the entire gamut of instruments that exist for a household to save in. And again, we ask not just, do you have a saving or investment in any of these instruments, but do you plan to save in any of these instruments over the next 120 days? 120 days, by the way, is the time it takes for us to run the survey every 4 months, right? Okay, on the borrowing side, we have both the source and the purpose of borrowing for every household. We can have multiple borrowings. Sources again range from very informal sources like a borrowing from your neighborhood shopkeeper, from your friends or family, from your employer, all the way to incredibly formal sources of borrowing, like borrowing from a bank. For every source of borrowing, we also know the purpose of that borrowing. And that purpose could vary, again, anywhere between debt repayment to an education expense, to a housing loan, to a marriage loan, etc. So we don't just know purposes and sources separately. We know for every kind of loan. So for example, for a particular bank loan, whether that bank loan is for debt repayment or for consumption expenditure or for vehicle financing. Okay, so that's the level of detail that we have on the borrowing side for these households. We capture a lot of information on household amenities. We know the type of roof, the type of wall. We know whether the household has a toilet on the premises. We know whether the household has access to electricity and running water. But this is not just a binary yes or no variable. We actually know how many hours in a given day the household has access to electricity and running water, and how many days in a given week the household has access to electricity and running water. So much richer data than just saying, yes, I have an electricity connection, or yes, I have a water connection. But you actually get electricity and water, and if so, for how long do you get that? Finally, we have this question on travel time, which I think is incredibly interesting, which is like a composite index of civic amenities. We ask the household the question, how long does it take you to travel a distance of 10 kilometers? And the answer to that question has to do with, road infrastructure, public transport infrastructure, a bunch of things, but it's a very useful indicator for the level of civic amenities that the household has access to. Okay, then we have a bunch of questions on household sentiment. We actually have 5 questions. 2 of them have to do with family finances. One looks backwards, the other look forward. 2 of them also have to do with how the household rates the financial and business conditions in India over a 1-year horizon as well as a 5-year horizon. And finally, we ask the household the question, do you think now is a good time to buy durables? All of this forms the second pillar of the data set, which is called Aspirational India, which is about household level characteristics to go hand in hand with the individual level characteristics that were captured in People of India. Next up, we basically try to get a sense of the balance sheet of the household. On the one side of the balance sheet is income. We collect income at the member level and at the monthly level, which is really remarkable. And not just at the member level and the monthly level, but we break up monthly member-wise income as wage income, as interest income, as dividend income, and pension income separately. So incredibly rich member income. To supplement this, we also have household income. Now, monthly household income is, of course, just the sum of monthly member income. But on top of that, it's also sources of income that can't be attributed to individual members. So many households in India run a small enterprise as a household together. Business profits from that enterprise can't easily be allocated to, person A and person B and person C. And for that reason, we capture business profits at the household level. Similarly, we capture government transfers at the household level, private remittances coming into the household at the household level, rent, sale of assets, etc. We do the same thing. So all of this is the income data. All of this is monthly. Like I said, it's both at the member level as well as at the household level. Along with the income data, we also capture very rich data on consumption expenditure. This is monthly household level consumption expenditure. We do this for 153 categories, which is an awful lot. And again, I can't go through all of them in this talk. So I'm just giving you some high level categories that are likely to be interesting and useful to many of you as researchers. This captures everything from loan repayments, that's EMIs, equal monthly installments, to food expenditure at restaurants. We had a question just last week, I think, from someone about whether we capture expenditure on intoxicants, and we do. Monthly expenditure on education, you name it, we capture that as a source. In fact, Just before I started this webinar, I got a message from one of our users asking if we captured information on household expenditure on gasoline, petrol, fuel, etc. Since those prices, unit prices have been going up a lot in the last few weeks. The answer is yes, we captured that. We have a long time series. So if you wanted to analyze, for example, how household consumption expenditure of fuel is like, it's very easy to do. To add to this, we also capture weekly snapshots of consumption expenditure for 27 categories. This is for categories that are very fast frequency, high frequency categories. For example, household consumption expenditure on biscuits or on cigarettes or other things like that. We also ask the household about their purchase over the last week. That's done to try and correct for recall bias. And so in the raw data, researchers get the monthly unadjusted household consumption expenditure information, the adjusted household consumption expenditure information after we adjust for recall bias using the weekly data, as well as the weekly data itself, in case you as a researcher would like to adjust monthly spends differently using the weekly expenditure information. So all of this is in the last pillar of the data set, which is called consumption pyramids. Now, I want to drill down into one area, which is health. One, just to give you a sense of how you can kind of work on an area across modules. So while we do capture 3 questions on health in People of India, which is, are you healthy? Were you hospitalized? Are you on regular medication? We also ask questions about household health level expenditure. And this is also a way for you to see how rich the consumption expenditure data get disaggregated. And so health expenditure, for example, gets disaggregated into hospital fees separately from tests, separately from doctor fees, separately from health insurance, separately from medications. Right? So all of this can be studied individually if, for example, you're somebody that's interested in studying health in India. This is just to give you an example of, I think, the richness of the data that's available to users in the survey. So all of this, really, this in a nutshell, is the data that's available to researchers. Again, I can't go through all 600 indicators. All of the indicators are available online for you to look through. By the way, the sample data is also available online. So if you go to our website, it's consumerpyramidsdx.cmi.com. You can click on how we do it. If you click on description of indicators, you'll get a list of all of the indicators. You can click on any one of them to read more about how the question is actually asked, what we intend to capture when we ask a particular question. At some point, you might have to log in with the username and password, but you can create that for free. There's no subscription associated with the documentation. The same is true for the sample data. You can download that and play with that for free. But anyway, I digress. That's about the 600 indicators on which we collect data, and I seem to be doing pretty well on time. So I'm going to spend now the remainder of my time just talking about the kind of new research that's been already written by others that are using the data. It's useful to see how other people are using the data. And I think it's also useful to talk about why I think people are using this data to talk about issues related to India. So on the bottom of your screens, you can see the different color codings for different areas that papers have been written in. Just to give you a sense of when the data was first made available public, even though the survey began on the 1st of January in 2014, the survey data the micro data wasn't actually made public, available to researchers until late 2017. And as soon as it was made available, there was one paper in 2017. This is by some researchers at NUS, the Indian School of Business in India, IIM Bangalore, and the Stanford GSP. It's an early draft, but I think the authors are in the process of putting together a much more refined draft, which is likely to come out soon. Immediately after that, in 2018, there were a couple more papers that came out. You can also see that there were papers that came out in 2019. These include, for example, the Narayanan et al. Paper. This ended up getting published in the QJE. Of course, there are many other papers that came out. A lot of research interest, I think, really built up around CPHS last year when people, I think, to be honest, were very amazed that we were able to keep the survey running through the lockdown. And like I said, we are now India's largest regular household survey. And we run like clockwork 3 waves every year without missing a beat since 2014. And so in 2020, a lot of papers were written. These include official World Bank publications, World Bank working papers written by folks at the bank, like the Bayer et al. Paper on the top of your screens and the Busolo et al. Paper on the bottom of your screens. These also include papers written by job market candidates who are on the market right now. These include a bunch of other papers, some of them that are already published in journals. Many of them were working papers are out, and papers have been submitted to journals, and they're awaiting journal decisions. We all know that the referee process takes some time, and so many of these working papers will turn into publications very soon. Even though we're just in the second month of 2021, there's already been a bunch of papers published in 2021 alone. One of them was published in JAMA. There are a couple of others that have been published in top journals. Just last week, there was a paper published in, I think it was Global Food Studies, which is looking at whether Indian households can afford what's considered to be the recommended diet from the perspective of a healthy diet. And so, like I said, there's a real volume of publications and research that's coming out across areas. And I think this is just the beginning. We now know that there are people working on questions that are more kind of marketing oriented or business oriented using the consumption expenditure data. There is a lot of interest now in financial inclusion and household finance using the rich data that we have on borrowing and liabilities, as well as on savings and investments. So over the next coming months, I think there's going to be a lot more papers that we're going to see coming out of this data set. But rather than getting to any one of these papers in detail, I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about what we think as CMIE, what we think worked for these researchers, and why there are so many papers that are being published. The first thing, which doesn't need to be repeated, but there's no harm in repeating it, is just the sheer size, right? We have an incredibly large 174,000 households across the country, representative panel survey. I mean, this in itself is, I think, something that's remarkable. And that's what's drawing a lot of people to work on India, even some people that wouldn't have worked on India otherwise. The second is there's so much data per household and per member, right? We collect over 600 indicators of data on each of these households and members, and we do this each wave. It's not like we do this just once and get a snapshot of it. So there's a moving time series of information for each of these households and members. Third, there's a lot of space for research. I think speaking as an economist myself and speaking as somebody that's interested in writing research papers, for a long time, it was very hard to write interesting papers on labor, on public finance, on household consumption, on a lot of questions, simply because survey data wasn't available. And I think we do a good job in filling a part of that gap. Of course, there are other surveys that need to be done and other surveys that are being done, and that's great. What works nicely with CPHS is that it's high frequency, that it happens every three times a year, every 4 months, without missing a beat, and that the data is released very quickly to researchers. And so there's now a much larger space that's available for research to be conducted in. Now, the next point, and this is something that I think a lot of our users really appreciate, which is that the turnaround time between data collection and data being available for research use is usually 1 day. Okay, so we complete a wave of the survey, and then the data is released to subscribers the very next day after the wave is completed. This time, we took 2 days. So the survey ended on the 31st of December, but we took until the 2nd of January to publish the data. That's because we included a brand new module on migration, and we needed to do a couple of additional checks. But you can expect that within 1 to 2 days, the data will be available to users to use the data, which I think is, again, a huge value addition. Next, there's complete data. So no waves are missing, no months are missing, and that means that the data are even more usable, right? It's not just that we've conducted 21 waves, but there's no gaps in the data collection. Okay, then we have very, very high quality data collection. So I've spent some time talking about the survey design. I've not spent a lot of time talking about survey execution, and many of you may have questions on it. So here's in a nutshell how we do survey execution. Again, if you're interested, there's much more documentation that's available, and we're going to be doing lectures in the near future on survey execution. But just to tell you in a nutshell, this is an in-person survey. It's conducted by a field staff of over 200 people. All our data is collected and verified through a proprietary technology stack that CMI has developed. The survey team, the field team, is managed by almost 100 supervisors. They do a variety of things through the tech infrastructure that we built for them. One is they check data entry in real time, not the next day, not the next week. In real time, the data is getting collected on handheld smartphones. The data is getting beamed back to CMI servers and then beamed back to supervisors. Supervisors are able to check in real time, was the data actually collected at the location of the household? They're able to do range validations. We don't do too much, or if any, artificial winsorization of the data. Instead, what we do is in real time, supervisors look at the data, for example, consumption expenditure data, and ask themselves the question, does this number make sense, or is this outside a range that makes sense? And in doing this, they're also assisted by the technology systems that we've built for them. They also check for internal consistency. So to give you an example, somebody could report as employed, but they could also report as having received 0 rupees in terms of wages. Now, one approach, a very ham-handed approach, would be to artificially prevent the enumerator from ever entering 0 as a wage if the person reported as employed. But we don't do that because, for example, you could be employed, but your employer didn't pay you wages because they weren't able to. This is something that's been happening an awful lot during the pandemic. And so you could very well be somebody that's employed and still make 0 wages. But we build in these checks so that the enumerator, as well as the manager, are asking themselves the question through the technology that, in one part of the survey, this person reported as employed. We should double check and make sure that when they say 0 wages, it was truly 0 and not survey error. We also make sure that the data that's collected in this wave of the survey matches the data that we've collected on this household across time. Because it's a panel, we have a long time series on each of these households. We know how they're spending money. We know how their incomes come in. If something drastically changes, all of this gets flagged to the supervisors, and the supervisors are able to resolve these issues in real time. And when I say real time, it's literally the supervisor picking up the phone, talking to the enumerator and saying, why is the data that you collected the way it is? And the enumerator has the opportunity to try and defend themselves and say, this is why. And the supervisor can either say, okay, I accept, or no, this doesn't make sense. You should go back to that household and collect the data again. Or the entire record is garbage and you need to redo the survey completely for that household. And these decisions are taken in real time. And so the enumerator hasn't moved too far from the household and they're able to go back to that household and collect that data. We also check for neighborhood consistency to make sure that the data that one household in a particular neighborhood is reporting is not completely out of line with what the rest of the neighborhood is reporting. Again, none of these are artificial constraints on data entry. These are just flags that get thrown up to supervisors and to enumerators to help them figure out if the data that they're collecting is actually the data that the household is giving them through their responses. We also have another team that checks regional trends. Since I'm not doing super well on time, so I'm not going to talk a lot about this, but this is another fascinating way in which we make sure that the data is accurately and well collected. Our supervisors also ensure that our survey execution is balanced, that we're covering all the regions, we're covering rural and urban in the appropriate proportions, etc. Finally, no human being can alter accepted data. Once the data is in the system and it's been accepted, not me, not Mahesh Vyas, the CEO of the company, not any survey manager, not any enumerator, nobody can alter data that's hit the system. And I think that's, again, very, very important, that there's no ad hoc fixing of data once it's entered the system. Another reason I think why people find the data useful is our high response rates. On average, we have response rates in the mid-80s. And so here's a quick chart just to show you what response rates look like all the way from wave 1 up through wave 18. This excludes the lockdown. Things were different during the lockdown. And like I said, we had another talk which is just on the lockdown, just so that we're already back to 80%, approximately close to 80% response rates, and we're going to inch back to our 85% response rates again. This is really, really high quality. I remember giving a talk to a US audience before about this, and they were just shocked that we get 85% acceptance rates. But you could still ask the question, I'm not satisfied, what's happening with the other 15%? And we can tell you that the majority of that 15% that don't get surveyed, a third of that is because the survey could not be executed for that given household. And this requires a little bit of an explanation. So like I've told you, the survey takes 4 months to complete. And so, there's month 1, month 2, month 3, month 4. In every month of the survey, we have roughly the same number of households that get executed. We don't want the survey to be lumpy, because if it is, then we miss out on important seasonalities, right? So if we don't do the survey during months where harvest season is going on, where there's holidays, for example, we're going to miss important trends in income and consumption expenditure. In fact, we don't just balance at the monthly level, we balance at the weekly level. So across the country, every week, there's roughly the same number of households that get executed across time. It's very important for us to maintain this. And so as a consequence, we permit very, very little spillovers. So we permit a spillover about 2 weeks between each, 2 days between each week. We permit almost no spillover at all across months. So if you can't hit a household in the given month, that's it. You don't get to survey that household. And absolutely no spillover beyond waves. So if you don't get to a household within a wave, the household doesn't get surveyed. And so the implication of this is that if a household can't get surveyed within a small window, usually a week, it just doesn't get surveyed at all during that wave. And so if we go back to our response rates, a third of the non-response is attributable to the fact that our enumerators weren't able to get that household on time, not because the household chose not to respond. If you look at refusal, it's very, very small. Only 1.6% of households where we actually reach the household refuse to participate in the survey. Okay, so very, very high response rates, and that's a great thing. We also have a very intact panel. We just did this check. If you wanted to, for example, do an event study around the lockdown and wanted 6 months of data on either side, you would have a balanced panel of almost 50,000 households at the monthly level. Okay, that's households, not individuals. So you have really large sample sizes, even from a panel perspective. Okay, finally, we have about 10 minutes left, which is great. And I'm going to do a quick detour into an area which may be a little abstruse, but I think bears mentioning, especially because it's very interesting, which is that we provide researchers sample weights. And that's not trivial. And a lot of machinery goes into doing that. So the appropriate weight that you would need is you would want to know how much does this row, how much does this sample household or this sample individual count for when you're trying to create a population estimate, right? And so the appropriate weight then is capital N over small n, where capital N is the total population that a given unit represents, and small n is the number of sample units for a stratum, okay? And so to do that, you need to do two things. You need to estimate small n, that's easy. Small n is just the sample size for that stratum, but also capital N, which is the total population of that region. Now, you could do that. You could try to estimate n. Census happens every 10 years, and that creates numbers for India's total population. The last census that happened was 2011. The next census that was supposed to happen is 2021. We're in 2021. As far as we know, the census hasn't yet begun. We're hoping that it does happen on time. But this is the data that we have in terms of population. Now, we started the survey in 2014, and there were no official estimates of population when we began the survey in 2014. There were projections made by a working group in the government called the Technical Group on Population Projections. They used data not from Census 2011, but actually from Census 2001, and published a report in 2006, making projections going out in time. Okay, so in principle, we could have used that. But let's go back to the ask that we have in terms of weights. We want capital N over small n, but we need to have the appropriate subscripts. We need this across time, because you could be trying to estimate something for one wave or another wave for 1 month or another month. And across geographies, you might want to estimate something just for one state, or maybe just for the very large stratum of one homogeneous region of one state. You might, right? And you could do this for different groups. You might want to create an estimate for households, for example, household expenditure. You might want to create an estimate at the member level, say education, Or you might want to create an estimate which is only for working age adults, working age members, say employment status, right? And so you need different weights for different groups, different geographies, and different time periods. Now, the full ask that you would need is as follows. You would need weights for households, individuals, and individuals above 15, daily, weekly, monthly, wavelength, and yearly weights. This is very ambitious, but that was our ask. And weights for different geographic levels. You could do all India estimation, state level estimation, HR level estimation, or a given stratum, or all the very large strata across India, for example, right? Now, if you go back to the census, to the projections of the technical working group, there are no daily projections. There are no estimates below the state, rural, urban level. So you can't make estimates for a homogeneous region or just the very large town stratum. And all of this is based on Census 2001 data, not even Census 2011 data. So we decided that we would come up with our own projections. Now, this is an incredibly difficult task. The way the technical group does this is they use something called the component methodology. They make projections using information that they have about fertility, mortality, and migration. That data comes from something called the sample registration system. We don't have access to that. And even the technical group said that that methodology isn't useful. They were uncomfortable using that methodology for making projections for populations of less than 10 million people. And we want to make populations all the way down to the very large stratum for one homogeneous region, which is just a couple of districts. So instead, we followed a slightly different approach. We created decade-wise compounded annual growth rates, or CAGRs. And to do this, you have to do a comprehensive mapping between all the towns, all the villages, all the districts between Census 2001 and Census 2011. And those of you that work on India know what a difficult task this is, because state boundaries change, district names change, districts themselves change, towns get merged, towns get bifurcated, villages join towns, villages get obliterated, all kinds of things happen. It was an incredibly difficult ask, but we did it. We matched each town and each rural portion of each district between 2001 and 2011. That allowed us to create individual CAGRs for every town separately and every rural component of every district separately. You'll see there's only 631 of them. That's because of the 640 districts in India, only 631 of them actually have a rural component. And we created separate CAGRs for individuals and households, etc. Now, this sounds like a lot of work, and we sum all this up, but let's see how well we do, okay? And so if you look at the official census numbers for 2001 and 2011, and if you look at our numbers, that's our 2011 number in yellow and our 2021 projection also in yellow. And you'll see we're doing remarkably close. We were so close to the actual Census 2011 estimate. Now, in 2019, the technical group finally released their Census 2011 based projections, which included their updated projection for 2021. We didn't have access to any of this when we started the survey in 2014, when we built this machinery for population estimation. And look how well we did. We are remarkably close to the government figures, even projected figures on population. And of course, there's future work to be done. Our approach will yield slightly inflated estimates for some technical reasons, and we're planning to improve our methodology by taking into account new administrative data, but also now the data that we collect ourselves on fertility, mortality, and migration, for example. And so our estimates, our projections of population are only going to get better over time. With those population projections, we're able to create all of these weights. That makes it very easy for researchers to create the estimates that they're interested in. And in fact, it allows you to create a representative estimate for any arbitrary choice of stratum type, geography, time period, and group. And I think that's really something that's interesting. And any summing up of geographies is consistent because of the way in which we've created our weights. A lot of machinery has gone into it, but I think it's created something that's very, very useful. There's one caveat here. Even though we've created weights for daily, weekly, and yearly estimation, because the survey happens at the frequency of a wave and income and consumption data are given at the frequency of a month, we only provide monthly and wave level weights in CPDX. The other weights are used for us internally for some other purposes. Now, that's on weights. I'm almost done. I only have a couple of minutes left. There's a couple of things that work for users of CPHS. One is our documentation. I've talked about it before. We have literally hundreds and hundreds of pages of documentation today. Our support, I think we have very high quality, fast, research-oriented support. Research-oriented being the key. We understand research needs. We understand what users are trying to do. We have a system for users to submit queries. We try to turn around answers within one business day. Usually we're successful. Sometimes queries are a lot more difficult. They require us to do some work and some time, but we always answer queries that users have about how to use the data. And I think that really helps in getting users comfortable with the data. Not finally, second to last, we have a great community. Over the last few months, we have been running one research seminar at least every month. Usually over 100 people turn up for these seminars. We have an excellent technical discussant. This is meant for researchers to basically showcase early research using our data, get critical feedback, almost like an early referee report before they submit their research to a journal. Everybody that's presented, I think, has found it very, very useful. Audience find it incredibly useful because they think of ideas. Discussants find it useful because they think of ways in which they can use the data. It's a great community. The community is growing. All of our research seminars are available publicly. They're open to anybody. You don't need to be a subscriber to the dataset. I encourage all of you to please come, ask questions, get familiar with the data. This is, I think, a very useful public good that's coming out of this data. Finally, and this is my last point before I end the talk, is we listen to user demands. And we really genuinely need this. Users asked for documentation, we wrote documentation. Users asked, for example, even for data, and we started new data collection efforts. So when the lockdown hit, a lot of users said to us, it would be really great if CPHS had more detailed coverage on migration. And we worked actively with a user group. We piloted questions. We worked on getting good at asking questions on migration. And then in the very last wave that just happened, September to December of last year, we released a brand new module on migration. And we're looking forward to these kinds of engagements in the future. We really work closely with users, listening to their demands of what they need. I'm not being facetious about this. Literally, Mahesh Vyas and I were with a user talking about some of the things that he found good and bad about the data set just before we started this webinar. And we enjoy doing this. We live and breathe the survey, and we're really, really keen on building high quality survey infrastructure that's going to last much, much longer than any of us, and being able to provide users of the data with something that's actually a value addition for their research. That's pretty much it. So what is CPHS? CPHS is India's largest regular household survey. We're the world's largest household panel survey. We've got 21 waves of data, over 174,000 households in our sample. We cover 98.5% of India's population. We have over 600 indicators of data. 30 papers have already been written. There are more papers being written literally every week, every month. That's it. We're here to answer as many of your questions as you like. Thank you so much. My name is Kaushik Krishnan. This is my email address. It's kkrishnan@cmi.com. Like I said, I'm joined today by Mahesh Vyas. Mahesh is the chief architect of the Consumer Pyramids Household Survey. Mahesh's email address is mahesh@cmi.com. Please feel free to reach out to us. We're available to answer questions, as many questions as you like. Follow us on Twitter. Everything that happens with the survey is posted on Twitter, so please do follow us on Twitter if you can. That's our website on the bottom, consumerpyramidsdx.cmi.com. Go have a look, read our documentation, download the sample data. If you're already a subscribing institution, start using the data some more. If you aren't, we're really looking forward to having you on board. Our job is to produce world-class survey data, and we hope that it's useful to research. And that's it. So thank you for your time. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and also take a minute to breathe. Mahesh, how have the questions been doing in Q&A? Is there anything that you would like to say? Hi, Mahesh. You may be on mute. We're not able to hear you.
Sorry. Thanks, Kaushik. That was a wonderful presentation. I enjoyed to the extent that I could hear and see what you were doing, because I was mostly busy answering a string of questions. So quite a few questions, a lot of them asking us, what do we cover? How do we cover? How is the data disseminated? Many of them would like to connect with us. And I think I've answered all of them but one. I think there's one or the two now which remain. One is just a thank you. Thank you very much for the thank you. Fatih Erol. How do you gain access to the data? What does it mean to subscribe? Kaushik, if you have taken a breath, could you answer that one?
Sure, Mahesh. Hi, Stephen. Thanks for the question. You gain access to the data through a subscription service. It's a paid service. There are somewhat different payments depending on whether you're a university, whether you're a research institution that doesn't do teaching, whether you're, for example, a consulting firm, etc. But the basic idea is, oh, and by the way, if you're a research institution or a teaching institution, the subscription cost is heavily subsidized. It's more than 50% less than what commercial market players have to pay to get access to the data. That's because that is because of CMI's strong commitment to making sure that research is done using this data. Subscription is for a year. It's usually at the institutional level. So if the institution gets a subscription, everybody at the institute can use the data. You get access to all the historical data since the beginning, that's 2014, and you get access to all the data that's released by us during the period of your subscription. It's fairly generous. There are some caps on how much data you can download, but in reality, they've not really been binding, though those caps are more to prevent misuse. It's not to prevent researchers from downloading the data and using the data. We'll certainly circle back with you later to also talk to you more about this, but I hope that answers the question just in a nutshell. If you're interested in knowing more, when you go to our website, which is consumerpyramidsdx.cmi.com, there's a little button that says request for subscription. Please feel free to click on it. It asks you for some information. Just go ahead and type that in. And I or one of my colleagues will get in touch with you very, very shortly.
One important thing, Stephen, I may add to what Kaushik just mentioned, is that you don't merely subscribe to this database because this survey just keeps continuing. We don't stop. So you subscribe the first time and you start doing research, and then you have a long-term relationship with us, wherein you keep getting additional data, you keep doing more research, and you have a long-term association with us. Because this is not a survey that has happened once and is over like most other surveys oftentimes do be. So this is a relationship and engagement that we look forward to with all the institutions that we work with. So we'd like to welcome you aboard.
Great. Thanks, Mahesh. I'm just looking through the Q&A. You seem to have done an amazing job in answering these questions in real time. If the audience have any questions that they feel haven't been answered yet and they'd like to ask them, we're happy to stick around.
Kaushik, I think I made a mistake when I heard you. Oftentimes I've written that you may please go to our website and get the information that you are seeking, any further information. And I have systematically typed consumerpyramids.cmi.com. Yes. I should have said consumerpyramidsdx.cmi.com. I missed that. I think we should write to all of those people to correct my mistake.
I'm going to put a message out to everybody that's still here. Our website is consumerpyramidsdx.cmi.com. There you go. Okay, so that's gone out to everybody through the chat. There were a couple of small questions here and there. For example, Mahesh, on do you cover X or Y or Z, or is the following thing available? I wonder if you want to get into any of those in more detail, and it's also fine if it also looks like the people asking those questions seem pretty satisfied with your answers. Just to take up one example, I think someone had asked whether we have information on social media usage, and you had said not exactly, right? But what's interesting is through our consumption expenditure module, we do have information on how much households spend on internet expenses and phone bills and things like that. And that's kind of potentially interesting and useful, as well as just questions on whether they have a mobile phone. So there are ways of, I think, creatively trying to answer questions, even when the survey doesn't necessarily capture a lot there. One other thing that I think, Mahesh, is interesting and worth mentioning, it may be useful to some of the audience members here, is often partner with institutions and organizations that want to ask additional questions on top of the baseline survey. That's a wholly separate thing. But if some of you out there have, a big research program on, say, crime or on social media or whatever it is, we do have the ability to partner with you to ask additional questions on top of our baseline. We've been doing that actively with a set of partners now for quite a while. I think the partners that we work with find it very useful. We also certainly find it useful. If that's something that you're interested in, again, please reach out to us. That's something that we'll be happy to discuss.
There's a question from Stephen on how were we able to work in Kashmir during the recent shutdown. So we have been successful in working in Kashmir for a long time. We have been doing the survey over there from 2014. During the lockdown, we had a problem, not because of the lockdown, but because of lack of internet services in Kashmir. So the lockdown did not stop us throughout the country. We did manage to do the survey. But when there is no internet or when the internet is shut for any reason, we cannot conduct the survey. And that was a serious limitation we had in Kashmir. What we did is, because there was a need for us to at least get some observations from Kashmir, we managed to get maybe a handful of observations by our people going to those villages or going to some towns and getting some observations at least through face-to-face interviews even during the lockdown period. Because the lockdown was not 100% lockdown, save for a few weeks. But whenever the internet was not there, because we required at least a few observations, we did do face-to-face interviews. But when there's no internet, no matter where we be, we cannot conduct the survey. So that was a serious handicap we faced in Kashmir.
Thanks, Mahesh. I'll add just one thing to this to kind of complete the answer to Stephen. Stephen, especially if you're interested in this also from the point of view of thinking about response rates, we did a whole talk which takes you through every event, not every, but many of the major events that became obstacles in our ability to conduct the survey, all the way from wave 1 in 2014 to wave 19, which includes, for example, a small discussion on the shutdowns in Jammu and Kashmir, but also, for example, the difficulties in surveying after the terrorist attacks that happened there, difficulties of surveying after the floods in Kerala, all kinds of natural disasters. There are additional gory details in our documentation, as well as on our YouTube channel, which is, if you just type in CMIE India in YouTube, you'll get to our YouTube channel. There's a playlist on survey design. The second talk in the playlist is on response rates, and we talk about that a bit more there. Okay, Mahesh, I think we did a good job. Oh, there's another question. Would you like to take that?
Okay, so this is an interesting question. How you track information about migrants who are still away from household? Do you rely on the household at the origin for information about them? So when a person leaves the household and goes elsewhere for whatever reason, we do not have any further information regarding that person. So if there was a person in a household who left the household because of education or employment or marriage or for whatever other reason, we just know that this person has left this household at this point for this reason and has gone to this location. We do not know anything thereafter. But the person's name and basic characteristics are there in our database. If the person comes back to this residence, we start asking information again. Where is the person come back from? And why has he come back or she come back? And then we have the information regularly. But during the person's absence from the household, we have no information regarding this person.
Great. Thank you, Mahesh. I'm going to mark that question as done. I'm going to take just a second to throw in our email addresses, both yours and mine, and I'll include our colleague Gaurav and Sadhana as well, just so that if folks want to reach out to us, they can reach out to us over email. And unless there are any additional questions, we can bring this session to a close. Would you like to give any parting remarks while I type out our email addresses?
No, I honestly have enjoyed receiving all the questions that were coming on while Kaushik you were speaking, and I enjoyed answering them in real time. If there's something that I missed, I encourage all of you to write to us, to write to Kaushik, you can write to me, Gaurav or Sadhana, and we'll be happy to answer your questions and to engage with you further as well.
Great. Thank you. Oh, I see there's one last question from Tista. I suppose we can answer that quickly. It's on parental backgrounds. Tista, you're right. So as long as parents are in the same household, we'll have information on the parents. But beyond that, for an individual member, we don't collect too much information about their parents. The closest we would get to that is state of origin, but that's not really very close. Okay, Mahesh, thank you so much. And thanks to the audience for coming. I know that it's frightfully cold if you're in the US. Thanks for making the time. Thanks for coming to listen. And we're really looking forward to seeing all of you in future research seminars, in lectures that we conduct, and answering your questions. Thanks, Mahesh, for making the time.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.